How's it going? This is Ethan Newton here with RPP Baseball. Today we're going to take a look at how we analyze the swing, working proximally to distally, with the focus on the proximal elements today. We break the swing up into two phases, the linear phase and the rotational phase. Here we have the timing component of the linear phase and then some key bullet points, and you'll see three very different styles of hitting here with Tatis, Vladdy, and Justin Turner. Essentially what we want to do is stabilize the pelvis initially, and then internally rotate as we prepare to move forward during the stride, and then keep that backside loaded as we move forward. Maintaining integrity between the pelvis and the spine is crucial for efficient rotation later in the swing. If the trunk starts to lean in either direction during the stride, we're going to be sacrificing power and adjustability. Moving into the rotational phase of the swing, if the athlete is able to move a loaded pelvis forward and maintain their center of mass, when the pelvis fires, they'll be able to transfer that energy up through the trunk. If they move through their scap load, which I'll get into a little bit later, they'll be able to transfer that energy out through the arms, and good wrist mobility will allow them to maximize the release of the bat into the collision with the baseball. All this happens literally in the blink of an eye, so we spend a lot of time making sure that the move during the linear phase is clean, so that during the rotational phase, the athlete can allow athletic creativity to take over based on different pitch locations and speeds and things like that. Here's a basic recap of those main pillars of the swing. When we evaluate the swing and look for any disconnects in the linear rotational phase, we work proximal to distal. So the primary aspect that we evaluate is how the athlete is controlling their lumbopelvic hip complex. Any issues there will likely manifest themselves in more distal parts of the body. Now we'll take a look at a handful of the disconnects that we evaluate in the linear phase of the swing with a focus on the proximal body part. All right, here's the list of disconnects that we're going to look at. You'll see that I have setup in there. The setup itself is obviously not a disconnect, but that's the first place that we like to look to make an easy adjustment. Two things that are very easy to control as a hitter is how we start and when we start. So if we can come back and make a setup adjustment based on something that we see later in the swing, that's a pretty good place to start. So with that in mind, this is what we want to be able to address if we do make a setup adjustment. Again, in isolation, there's not really anything in the setup that's going to tell us that something's wrong. We look down the chain and then we'll come back and make a setup adjustment if necessary. Alright, so Buxton is a good example here because he definitely has a unique setup with how he's contorting his body, but he's such an explosive athlete, and I would venture to say at this point in his career it's more about being consistent. He's a pretty good example of a guy that's, I would guess, probably found that 80 to 90% is actually better for him than trying to muster every ounce of power that he has, but I'm just speculating there. But when we see how small and compact his move to the baseball is now, and from how he was moving earlier in his career, this is a setup that makes a lot of sense for him. Here's our definition of excessive negative weight shift. So this is an issue with the initial pelvis stabilization, and a lot of times with this, we'll see an athlete actually hinge well, but they continue to drift over their backside, and really that might just come back down to teaching concepts. So they might have an idea in their mind of how they need to move in their load. And if we can sort of fix that misconception of needing to sway over the backside, a lot of times that can clean things up. Typically we'll see low pelvic and torso velocities on K-vest anytime we see this disconnect on video. So with excessive negative weight shift, we'll draw a line up from the back of the, back toe of the hitter's back foot. And if at any time during the load the player's back knee gets outside of this line, it'll be considered excessive negative weight shift. And we have Austin Riley here, and obviously he does not do that. Riley's a great guy to use for this, so I'll say this to young guys a lot. Your rhythm can take you into your load, but don't mistake just moving or shifting the weight backwards as the load, which I think happens a lot with young hitters. So with Riley here, you can see a little negative move in his rhythm right there. But once he starts to hinge, boom, there's no more sway, and he's getting into his backside and he's preparing to move forward. I'm also going to deviate a little bit here, but Riley's a good example to use for this.
he's a great guy to look at for how he creates his separation. Because if you watch this video full speed, which I'll play it again, it looks like he creates a lot of manual separation with his arms and his hands, but when you slow it down and just see where his hands are at in space, the hands really don't move a ton. If you use the woman in white behind him with the hat in terms of where his hands are at, see his hands pretty much stay there, and he instead of forcing them back, he just makes his forward move and creates some natural stretch across the middle of his body. And that was what I briefly touched on earlier when I said passing through the scap load and not trying to jack the arms and the shoulder into a loaded scap, where we'll then lose direction and actually sacrifice elasticity and quickness in the swing. And this shows why we focus on moving an integrated pelvis and spine forward to get that natural stretch across the body's muscle slings.
Now looking at poor rear hip load, this is similar to excessive negative weight shift. The primary difference here is that the athlete, with this disconnect, does not hinge the pelvis, meaning it's not stabilized and ready to move the center of mass forward, or at least they won't be able to consistently. Similar to excessive negative weight shift, we'll probably see low pelvis and or torso velocities on K-vest, and then we'll likely see some low rotational acceleration on blast.
For rear hip load, we'll pause the video at the end of the negative move and observe if the hitter is showing hinge and some internal rotation in the rear hip socket. Creases in the pants may be visible, which we see right there with Vladdy. All right, and then we just want to make sure that the rear hip is inside the back ankle and that the athlete hasn't shifted the pelvis over top of his back foot, and Vladdy is good there. Vladdy is another good example to use here because the natural rhythm of his toe tap takes him into his load, but again, that initial hinge and then the coiling into his back hip as he's moving forward is what we're looking for here.
For inability to maintain center of mass, again, here's our definition of it. This is really that importance of the role of the lumbopelvic hip complex in maintaining the integrity between the pelvis and the spine and not letting the trunk start to fall forward during the stride. If that does happen, we'll likely see low torso velocities on K-vest, as well as low rotational acceleration, potentially low attack angle, and some connection issues.
All right, for maintaining center of mass, we have Harper here first, and we'll draw a line from the player's inside eye to the belt buckle at the end of the negative move. Whoops. All right, the hitter should transition from a slight forward tilt at negative move, like the line slanting towards the back foot, which we see here if the pelvis is loaded properly, to a slightly backwards tilt at heel plant. So we'll draw that same line from the belt buckle to the inside eye, and we see that line has reversed here for Harper if the pelvis has begun to rotate appropriately. If either of these postures are reversed, then the hitter is not maintaining center of mass. And I have two videos here for a reason, and I'll get into that now. So Harper's is pretty straightforward, which is why we measured him first. But with the topic of maintaining center of mass, what we don't want athletes to do is see this sort of backward tilt here and force a backwards lean and a manipulation of the trunk during rotation, because then we'll be collapsing on the backside and losing energy that we could be extending out through the baseball. So the way that this tilt happens is by the middle of the body, the pelvis firing underneath the head. So that's what we're looking for, not a forced backwards lean when we're going into rotation. So I have Ramirez here, and you'll see he gets pretty creative with his swing in order to hit this ball a long way for a home run, and that's definitely something we don't want to discourage. So if you look at the exact measurement guidelines of this disconnector, of this part of the swing, you could argue that he would fail the center of mass test. So we have him at negative move here, and he's good. And then when that heel gets down, so you could look at this and say, okay, he's not maintaining center of mass. But again, the big thing that we're looking for is the middle of the body firing and accelerating under the top half. And he's hitting an off-speed pitch here, so he bought a little bit of time and got really creative with how to get his barrel to this pitch. So this is something that we would not discourage, and this is another reason why we watch several swings within a round versus game-like feeds. And we always ask hitters what's happening in the game, so we know we're not trying to fix something that doesn't need fixing.
Similar to inability to maintain center of mass, lack of linear momentum happens when the athlete sort of pushes the pelvis forward, or maybe they reach with their front foot, and then everything is left sort of on their backside. This could also be a really good opportunity to reteach a concept if they don't truly understand how to rotate the pelvis. When we see this issue, we'll likely see some low pelvis and torso velocities, and high attack angle could also be an issue on blast. But I've actually seen that sort of hide itself, where the athlete might have an uphill path, but because they can't get their swing off quickly, they actually get beat. And it'll really show itself more in vertical bat angle than it will in attack angle in terms of a one-to-one issue with byproduct.
For linear momentum, we'll draw a vertical line up from the outside of the hitter's rear foot in their setup, and if at any time prior to contact the athlete's heel gets behind the line, this would represent a lack of linear momentum. And Soto's a great one to use here because, like, just how he finished right there, you could look at this finish and somebody might go, oh look, he's squishing the bug, but he really doesn't. The back foot, as you'll see, gets peeled off the ground as the pelvis rotates. His backside gets through the ball there. He's not spinning or collapsing, and then just because of how wide his setup is, he ends up on those toes, bam, like kind of falls back after extension. So that's an individual finish based on his body and his setup, but not a lack of linear momentum.
Poor lower half stability is one I see a lot in guys, and a lot of times, again, it comes back to a misconception. Young hitters think that they generate force by leaping off the backside, similar to a sprint. And if you're perfectly on time, you can generate force this way, but it's not the most efficient way to rotate the body in the baseball swing. Also, as you get older and guys have better secondary pitches, you're going to be more susceptible to those and not have as much adjustability in the swing. We'll typically see maybe some low pelvis velocities on K-vests and low torso velocities, but oftentimes I've seen really good pelvis velocity. It just doesn't transfer up the chain to the torso. So we know that the hitter doesn't have that pelvis and spine integrated to where that energy can transfer up through the kinematic chain. As a result of that, usually the arm is early in the sequence, and that can lead to some attack angle issues because the hitter is sort of yanking the bat through the zone.
To test lower half stability, we'll slowly play the video into toe touch. If the player's back foot pushes off the ground prior to the front toe contacting the ground, which would be a loss of torque force, or he or she leaps off the backside, very similar concept, or the hitter's pelvis leaks open before a swing decision is made, which would be an early loss of the pelvis load, then the athlete lacks lower half stability. So we got Devers here riding out a changeup, and as he moves forward, buying time, you see him staying in his back hip as he moves forward, which is the foundational component of what we're looking for here. Different anatomical makeups, ankle mobility, femur positioning, etc., can affect exactly how that back foot looks as it's interacting with the ground during the forward move. But if we're staying in the back hip and not pushing or leaping or extending out of the back hip socket, we should be pretty adjustable, which we see here with Devers. This is just a great piece of hitting, maintaining that ground connection as he buys time to hit this changeup for a home run.
Here's just a couple of the rotational disconnects that we're going to look at. One of them is going to deal pretty directly with the concepts that we've been discussing thus far. And the other one's going to be a little bit less about what's happening in the nets and more so about a physical and strength issue that needs to be addressed. Now looking at poor axis of rotation, this is about keeping that backside loaded as we move forward in the stride. So you remember we talked earlier about the initial load or pelvis stabilization with the rear hip load. We want to be able to keep that backside loaded as we move forward prior to a decision being made, and continuing to stretch those muscle slings that run across the middle of the body. This is where we really see guys lose a lot of power, is when they lose that hip load moving forward. On K-Vest, we'll probably see some low speed gains, as well as low rotational acceleration and high vertical bat angle on blast, because they're relying on the upper half and the shoulders or a front side move to sort of yank the bat through the zone.
For rear hip load, at the peak of the negative move, we'll draw a line from the rear hip to the lead hip, and then play the video into toe touch. And if the hitter does not move the pelvis forward, if the line starts tilting upwards noticeably prior to a swing decision being made, meaning the pelvis is leaking open, then the athlete will have lost his or her pelvis load and will have a poor axis of rotation. So not much to say here with Trout. This is a great video, really good angle. His axis of rotation is great. We see him arrive with the loaded pelvis to toe touch, or until he decides to swing, which might be, rotation might happen a little prior to toe touch if it's an inside or an up and in pitch. But really good video here for Trout. And just to go backward for a second and kind of rewind to the negative move and the initial hip load, you'll see here Trout's load takes him right into his backside there. So there's very little extra movement or backward sway for him. I mean, not really any at all. So again, I think young hitters have this idea that they need a big backwards weight shift and a big inward turn and coil of the shoulders, and that's how you load. And really all that excess movement can actually mess up and take away from a consistent forward move here, which is when the actual muscle loading phase takes place. And we need that for efficient rotation and energy release later in the swing. All we need with that initial load is to stabilize. Then it's just about timing and making our forward move. So that initial hip load means nothing if we can't carry it forward like we see here with Trout.
With an inefficient lead leg block, we might look for the hitter losing the pelvis just a split second too early and sort of leaking open in the swing, in which case they won't be able to block up. But if everything's clean in terms of how the middle of the body is moving, and the hitter just can't block up on that front side, like we'll see a collapse on the front side, which is definitely more typical in younger hitters, then it's primarily going to be a physical and a strength issue. So it's important to remember the swing happens literally in the blink of an eye. So if our body can't support the force that we're trying to produce, this is where we'll see some deficiencies creep up, and the athlete just needs to get stronger. On K-Vest, pelvis and torso velos are likely going to be low here, but this is another situation where we might see the pelvis velocity be in range, but because the pelvis can't decelerate, that energy does not continue up the kinematic chain.
To evaluate the lead leg block, at first move, which is about the first 3 inches or so that the hitter moves the knob, beginning rotation, we'll draw a vertical line up just in front of that front hip crease. I can get a little closer there probably. There we go. And if at any time prior to contact the athlete's pelvis moves in front of this line, like closer to the pitcher, he or she will have an inefficient lead leg block, and this is a tremendous job here, turning right behind that line by Matt Olson. So we have a pretty unique swing here with Olson, with where he starts his hands. But he makes a big forward move here in terms of the distance that he covers. So pretty good example to use. And once he starts rotation, those hips finish moving in the frontal plane, and he's able to rotate efficiently through contact. And actually kind of contradicting myself here, since I was just talking about how big Olson's forward move is, or how long it is. But when this is a mechanical deficiency in hitters, I actually typically see it in guys with smaller strides because their body wants to continue moving and continue loading, but they've probably been told to get their front foot down or early, or they're scared to get beat, and it actually leads to a less efficient swing. Their hips continue to slide as they're transitioning into rotation, and it really hurts their force production. But again, if the middle of the body's moving well for a guy and we see a collapse or an early rollout of that front leg prior to the hands blocking, like right there, it's likely a strength issue. And that front foot just needs to grab really until the barrel releases, which we see here with Olsen, and then the force of a high-level athlete, as fast as those guys swing the bat, that front foot will probably get released, which we see right there just after contact for Olsen. Sometimes it'll happen a split second before contact. Again, we just need it until those hands block up. And especially if it's an inside pitch and a guy pulls it, that foot will come unhinged. But this aspect is critical for pelvis deceleration and an efficient transfer up the kinematic chain. That's all we got for today. Again, the foundational component of this presentation was how the middle of the body moves and what we look for from the middle and then work out. When there are issues with elements that we discussed today, that's usually when we see more distal issues pop up in a guy's video analysis. So we just want to always make sure we're starting at the source, at the root of the issue if possible. Thanks for listening and watching, everybody.
I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. If you're interested in our training material on pitching, hitting, or strength training, you can reach us at rocklandpeakperformance.com or on Twitter and Instagram at RPP_baseball. You can also call our front desk at 201-308-3363 or email us at rpp@rocklandpeakperformance.com. Also, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel on the way out.